Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gage Averill. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts at the University of British Columbia, and it is a real treat to be here today to welcome you all and open up this last Ignite Series book club of the 2021 year. It's also my pleasure to do what we call the land acknowledgement here at UBC, and it was about 25 years ago where the Musqueam Band and the University of British Columbia created at that point, an unprecedented agreement to begin to repair relations. And it resulted in the university taking the opportunity to remind ourselves, to remind all those who visit us of our relationship to the Musqueam people at every major event on campus. And we say, we are on the traditional ancestral, originally, a traditional ancestral territory of the Musqueam people. And we've added over the years, almost all cases, the term unceded to really focus on the fact that this was not a gift, but an appropriation of land without treaty on the part of Canada and the province of British Columbia. And over the time, some of us will insert the term occupied to really heighten the political valence of this relationship. And we also recognize, especially given that we are all coming in from different places these days under video conferencing, and also because UBC Vancouver's work takes place in a broader area, that we're on the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish people's lands. This has helped us have to do these recognitions, kind of an unfolding dialectic, really, of a relationship between, the recognition, but also the increasing attention to the issue and the increasing sense of the political importance of reparations, of justice in these relationships. And it's, the work of the TRC a couple of years ago, and their report, and more recently the effect that the discovery of graves of children in the residential schools has had this effect of really forcing us to, all of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to continue to challenge what we as a university can do to to move towards justice and reconciliation. So it's important to begin with this recognition, especially at this event. And I will be introducing someone important to this event, but that's the creator of the Ignite book series, and that's Manel Matani, who's an associate professor here at UBC in the Institute for Gender, Race, and Social Justice. She also has a affiliate position to the School of Journalism, Writing, and Media, and is pretty comfortable being in geography departments as well. So very obviously a broadly impactful and interdisciplinary scholar. Manel has most recently served, and actually is serving up until midnight tonight, as the senior advisor to the present provost on racialized faculty, from which role this book series emanates. But as of midnight tonight, she becomes, and I'm proud to announce, if you haven't heard the news yet, she will be the Brenda and David McLean Chair in Canadian Studies in the Faculty of Arts at the university, where she's working on a project that talks about the constellations of care. She may elaborate on that. Up until a couple of years ago, she was also a host of a very highly respected and popular radio show here at a commercial station called Roundhouse Radio. Generally, her choices were amazing, with only one exception. That was my appearance on there talking about Bob Dylan's Nobel Prize. But generally, she made much better choices. Her more recent creative work is involved nonfiction writing that's appeared in places like Maisonneuve, This Magazine, and she's recently a finalist with the National Magazine Award, definitely not the Nationalist Magazine Award, and the Digital Publishing Award. So I want to express on the last day of her job as the provost's advisor, my huge gratitude for the work that she's done, not just on this series, of course, but as a really indispensable person for this university in a period of rising attention to issues of race in the university, a period where expectations for the university's performance, for its understanding, its commitment around issues of anti-racism has been rising, and she's had an extraordinary role in helping this university develop and focus among many things, the difficulties that faculty face, racialized faculty face in this historically white and very privileged and very Eurocentric institution. And I know this series reflects a combination of things about Manel. It's her love of conversation, I would say, of the interview format, which she is extraordinarily good at herself. Her passion for building community among racialized faculty and among faculty in general, and especially, passion for creative nonfiction, where these sort of the overall genre in which these memoirs are attached. All to say that this thing we're doing today is very much Manel. And it's part of the genius and beauty of this series. She's designed it such that we bring into a dialogue an interlocutor, an interviewer, and an author of a memoir. And it really couldn't be more of a kick or more of a pleasure for me to have David Chariandy back at UBC. And a couple of you who were around last year may remember my respect and admiration for his writing from the time I introduced him and his speech on this series last year. And then really one of my favorite people at UBC, Ayesha Chaudhry. So, and I have to say, Ayesha, congratulations. It's a household congratulations, because you are now the only dual CRC household that I know of in this university. Her partner, Rumi, was awarded the CRC today. So it's really with considerable thanks for her vision, the care in organizing this important series, that I hand you over to Manel Matani. Manel, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Gage. That was extraordinarily generous of you, and I'll hold those words close to my heart. I'm really grateful to be working and learning with you here at UBC. And before we begin, I really want to make sure I also thank Andrew Zeri, our provost, for teaching me so much. I've been really so privileged to stand by his side, learning from the entire provostial team. So thank you, everybody in the provost's office as well. But it's my honor today it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. David Chariandy in conversation with Dr. Ayesha Chaudhry today at Ignite. And I think Gage has really described the series really beautifully. So I want to start us off with this. The great writer Bell Hooks tells us, when we choose to love, we choose to move against fear, against alienation and separation. And I think this is what David Chariandy does so beautifully in his memoir, I've been meaning to tell you, a letter to his daughter, offering us a heartfelt reckoning between the past and the present. Let me tell you a little bit about David in case you don't know. He grew up in Scarborough, as you know, is a suburb of Toronto. He's currently a professor of English at SFU, specializing in Black, Caribbean, and Canadian literatures, as well as creative writing. His work has been published in journals like Transition Magazine, Postcolonial Text, and others. And he has co-edited 3 special issues of journals, most recently also with Transition Magazine 124, Writing Black Canada, with one of our own English professors here, the great Fanuel Antwi. David's debut novel was entitled Sukkuyant, and it's a brilliant conveyed meditation on memory and forgetting, and it was nominated for more than 10 literary awards. And of course, all of you will probably know Brother, which speaks poignantly and powerfully about a complicated and enduring love between mothers and sons. A really, really beautiful book. It's been nominated for 14 literary prizes, winning a lot of them, and including the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize and the Toronto Book Award. And of course, he is also the winner of the highly prestigious Yale University Wyndham Campbell Prize for a body of fiction. Today, David's going to be in conversation with Canada Research Chair and Professor of Gender and Islamic Studies at UBC, someone who I am honored to call a friend and colleague, Dr. Ayesha Chaudhry. In 2018, she was named a Trudeau Fellow and a member of the Royal Society of Canada. But I don't want to just talk about Ayesha's extraordinary academic talents today because they're so innumerable. Anyone who's fortunate enough to know Ayesha knows that she is a woman with a wide-ranging set of gifts. And today we get to see them all on full display. In her new memoir, The Color of God, Ayesha generously shares with us an endearing, intimate, and moving portrait of what it means to grow up as a South Asian Muslim woman in Canada. The New York Review of Books called it exquisite and engrossing, vulnerable, raw, and true. The color of God bristles with joy, and deep grief pulsates on every page. Its heartbeat is found in its continual and determined ability to offer us a vision of a world that could be. Her intellectual insights infuse every page. It really is a book that you can't put down. Speaking fiercely and in no holds barred way, Ayesha takes our hand and explores themes of faith, belonging, mourning, and of course, love. We're so fortunate to have these two brilliant writers with us today, and I really couldn't think of a more beautiful way to end my time as Senior Advisor on Racialized Faculty. Please join with me in virtually clapping for David Chariandy and Ayesha Chaudhry.
Well, thank you so much, Gage, first of all, and thank you also, Manal, for such thoughtful opening remarks and for extraordinarily kind words in my respect. I am here so excited and honored to be doing this interview, first as part of this speaker series that has been truly extraordinary. And I wonder if we could take a moment, and this was in fact Ayesha's idea, being I think in general more thoughtful than me, really kind of talking a little bit about you, Manal, this speaker series, and also the work that you've been doing at UBC, of course. And Ayesha would be able to speak a bit to your work there, your central work there. But really more broadly, when you talk about constellations of care, I see you and your work embodying that in ways that are extremely rare and are so desperately needed in these times. So I don't know, Ayesha, if now is a moment. This has been, a long introduction, but I think at the end of this series and this particular moment, seeing Manal go off to a new position, I wonder if you're right, Ayesha. This is the moment to say a few words.
I think it's the moment. Thank you so much. I want to, before we started, I wanted to make sure we took a moment to really, I want to thank the Faculty of Arts for supporting the series, the Provost Office, and and Gage for his generous introduction. I also want to take a moment to really honor and express our gratitude for Manal in her role as Senior Advisor to the Provost on Racialized Faculty. I have been at UBC I came here in 2011, I've been here for 10 years. And I know that Manal coming to UBC has transformed my experience of UBC. And, educational institutions are so often sites of violence and brutality. They are a tool of colonialism and imperialism often. And the discovery of the unmarked graves around residential schools are only bringing this to light even further. And I want to say again, these graves are of children, of precious little children. And so much of education is often about straightening and disciplining and losing a sense of ourselves, actually, instead of finding ourselves. And, some people have argued that the university is an arm of the neoliberal state. So in a place like this, it is astonishing, really, when in this space we can find moments, and they're always fleeting and they're always ephemeral, of actual learning, of real moments of school. And I'm thinking of school here like the fish, where we're briefly swimming together in the same direction. And I remember being at one of the talks that Manal organized, one of the interviews with Desmond Cole and Candace Callison. And I remember thinking, looking around and thinking, oh, this feels like school in the best way possible, without the brutality, without the violence, but like a place of actual learning and teaching. So Manal, I want to just take this moment. You've done a lot of things in this role. I just want to thank you deeply for creating spaces of real learning and community in relationship, driven not by the ideas of discipline, but rather by curiosity. So thank you for doing that for us.
You're going to make me cry, you guys. This is so generous. Thank you, both of you. I really appreciate it so much.
What a beautiful thought. Many beautiful statements and thoughts, but a type of work driven not by discipline, but by care, by love. I think puts it so well. Well, I think I really think we should turn now through the opportunities provided by Manel to your book, Ayesha, The Color of God. Such a magnificent achievement that I really want to begin by congratulating you about. There were quotations from reviewers that I was going to read, but I think that's been a bit preempted. So I'll move to my own questions, if I may. Ayesha, in the acknowledgement section of your book, you write that although writing can feel cerebral and lonely, it is fundamentally a metabolizing of experiences and a reaching out, a reaching toward. To whom specifically do you see yourself reaching toward in writing The Color of God?
So I think, I love that you're beginning with the acknowledgements. And it was such an interesting thing that the acknowledgements apparently in literary books go at the end of the book and not in the beginning of the book. But in academic books, they go in the front. So I'm glad that we're beginning with the acknowledgements, actually. And I begin the acknowledgements with a set of verses from the Quran, actually. And one of the verses that I really meditate on, that I want to meditate on, is Innal insana la yatgha an ra'ahu istaghna, that the human transgresses when she imagines herself independent. And so in many ways, in saying that, I was really addressing the myth of, independence and ourselves as discrete individuals. And I was writing these words in the middle of the pandemic and also in the middle of the fires that were bringing the smoke from the United States to Canada, to Vancouver. And I was thinking about how the smoke doesn't care about the nation state, like these ideas we have about separateness, about the nation state, about family, about religion, about all these ways that we separate ourselves out from each other. We're actually deeply fundamentally connected to each other. And the reminders of that were abounded around me. So, I was thinking about how writing is always a conversation, even when we're doing it alone. And Toni Morrison has this quote that I've actually often struggled with for a very long time. I don't know the exact quote, but she says something like, no one cares about your little story. When she's thinking about people writing, she's like, don't just write your own story, do something more than that. And it's like a thought of hers that has stayed with me in the course of writing this book. And I think what she was trying to say is that if you're going to tell a story, imagine its connection to something bigger. And I think that's what I was trying to do with the book. And so in terms of who was I writing to, I was writing to a younger version of myself, a 19-year-old version of myself, who was basically like a cute little fundamentalist. So she was going to struggle with the things that I was saying in the book, but she was a real interlocutor. I knew how she would respond to the things that I was saying. So I felt like I was in conversation with her. And through her, I think I was in conversation with Muslims more broadly, with immigrants in diaspora, with South Asians, with anyone who's thinking about belonging and exploring the ways that home is the place where you both find yourself and lose yourself. And I was also, I think when I was writing, I think it's important to say that I was writing to I was trying to practice writing to a caring and loving audience, which allowed me more softness in my voice and in the ways that I could say things and what I could say. We're so often told that our stories don't matter, that like they're too niche, but actually, as John Edgar Weideman argues, telling stories is how we survive. And so I was trying to insist on the right of thinking of the universal through a positionality that is rarely allowed to stand in that position. So that's what I was doing.
Just as maybe a quick follow-up, you are, of course, an academic. I'd say most of your writing is academic and oriented to particular audiences, particular disciplines as well. There's for me a compelling mix of evocation, beautiful evocation of a life lived, and there was also analysis, crucial analysis in your book. Did you feel yourself drawing from your insights as an academic, or did you feel yourself in tension with the discourses that you typically use as an academic?
So that's a great question. I think I was definitely using my idea, I was definitely drawing. I was definitely an academic when I was writing the book. So I never stopped and I never tried to take her away, because I think in many ways the book is a culmination of all the academic thinking I've been doing around the issues that I was raising, the conversations that I was having in the book. I personally think of the book as embodied theory. So I really did think I was actually trying to make arguments through stories. I was never in my mind telling stories just for the sake of telling stories. I think as people of color, so often our stories are mined, are extracted from us, and they're like, we have to share them in order to justify the right to be in a conversation. And at the same time, they're used to marginalize us and make our concerns irrelevant. So I really was very careful about that. I was thinking about that deeply when I was writing. And so but in my mind, I never told a story unless it could make an argument, and I didn't tell a story if it couldn't make the argument that I wanted it to and the way I wanted it to. So that was very intentional for me. When we got to the publication phase and I was speaking to the marketing team, they were like, what is this book? What do you think about it? And I was like, well, I think of it as embodied theory. And they were just like, yeah, there's no section in a bookstore called embodied theory, so we're going to call it memoir. And so I think I feel like I stand in tension probably with like the genre, or like, and in terms of my discipline, with like the expectations of what excellent writing or what rigorous or writing can look like, because I really wanted to break that form and write differently, write accessibly about ideas that usually are like considered to be the purview of an elite.
Thank you so much for that response. There's so much there that I would love to continue speaking about, and maybe we'll get to it in later questions. But many thanks. That's my mind is swimming a bit about regarding some of those challenges, in fact, that you raise about how our work is oftentimes mined and positioned. I might ask you a different sort of question first, though. One of the very powerful experiences in your, oh, pardon me, sorry, I'm going to shift to another question. Your book is framed by the sudden and inexplicable death of a beloved nephew, whose name, Batula, means the color of God, a wording and a concept that also appears in the Quran. Could you talk a bit about about that phrase, the color of God? Could you provide a bit of context for it, and why, aside from the obvious reason, why it would become the title of your book?
So I struggled a lot with the title of this book. Once I was in the middle of writing it, I just had no idea what I would call it. And I was actually at Radcliffe. I was a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard when I started writing this book unexpectedly. And I say unexpectedly because I actually went there to work on a different project, and I never intended to write this book. And then I feel like it just came to me. Which is an annoying way to talk about writing, I know, but that is what happened.
Right.
So I was, at one point while I was like in the throes of the writing, I was thinking about names, and I have this insecurity that I'm not good at naming things. And I was walking with my partner, and we were actually walking in Mount Auburn Cemetery. And I just remember exactly the moment when I remember exactly where I was when I was like, oh, it's going to be called my nephew's name. It's going to be Sawatullah, which means the color of God. And so, Sawatullah's passing was a deeply traumatic event in the life of my family. And it led me personally to a crisis of faith. And the book in many ways is me contending with that crisis. And so it's framed by the crisis that emerges from his passing. And the verse itself has always been one of my favorite verses in the Quran, because it's a verse that immediately forces the reader to be in relationship with the text and to take account of our role in meaning making. Like, you cannot read that verse without filling in meaning in it. And I kind of love how it like fronts that. And in the process of filling in meaning, we learn about ourselves. Who do we think God is? Can God have a color? What do we think color is? What color could God be? And so when Subutala passed away, I feel like I was suddenly like asking myself questions I thought I knew the answers to. And one of the things that I was asking myself questions about was like how to fix grief. Like I wanted to fix it. This felt so terrible. And I wanted there to be an endpoint. I wanted to know what were the stages that I would go through and how would I get out of it. And as time went on, as the years went on, I realized, well, the problem was in the question that I was asking, because there's actually no way to, of course, fix grief. There's no linear end to, there's no conclusion. And the answer actually was in his name. Like I had to find my relationship with it and come to terms with it. And I had to fill in the meaning for myself. No one was going to be able to do that for me. So in that way, like I think the story also, follows that kind of, I think the story of the book, it's like it loops and it spirals and it circles, because I think that's what grief does actually. And that's what time is like, and that's how we live. And so I was trying to honor that in the cyclicalness. Yeah.
Thank you. One of the most powerful experiences in your book has to do with, or narrated in your book, has to do with how your parents came to adopt what you describe as a fundamentalist or puritanical expression of Islam. You write in the book, under a steady barrage of racism and xenophobia, my parents gave up on trying to assimilate into Canadian society. You also write in another moment in necessarily hurtful language, the language I've heard myself hurled at my father's side of the family. You write this: if all they were going to be was Paki, they might as well be proper Pakis, learn their culture and religion, be the people they were going to get shit for being. You go on to describe yourself as being raised in the cradle of a religious identity, fashioned as a shield, a protection from racism. I'm mindful now of your really so compelling response to one of my earliest questions, and the question of embodied theory, because I think the answer lay somewhere in there. But I wonder if I could maybe move in that direction, again, using these quotes as a prompt. I'm struck in these quotations by a certain tonal insistence, in that you evoke those circumstances experienced by your parents and by you, again, in such rich, truly embodied ways. And yet, that is not enough. You also feel the need to provide the appropriate analysis of the situation, and to do so repeatedly. I wonder if you could speak to what I guess I would describe as a tonal insistence in your book around this issue, a needful tonal insistence, I would argue.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question, because I absolutely do that. Like I'll tell a story and then I'll do a reading of that story sometimes, just to be like really clear about what I'm trying to say, knowing that others might read the story differently, but I want to offer my own reading of it. And I think this is related again to this question about this point that I brought up earlier, that one of the ways that we survive is through telling our stories. Our stories are how we transfer information, how we learn from each other, how we teach each other. I don't think it's accidental that scriptures are filled with stories. They're one of the most powerful ways to teach and learn. And also, if we can't tell our stories, I think we really do lose a sense of ourselves. And so, but at the same time, it's really scary to tell our stories. And I think as a Muslim woman, it was very scary to tell my stories in the context of racism and Islamophobia, which was always like lurking around in the peripheries, if not like inside my own eyes. And so the shame and the fear that I think racism and Islamophobia inculcate in us stops us from telling our stories, which is a way of stopping us from surviving. So I wanted to actually make space to tell these stories, which I think are rarely told, actually. And while I was telling the stories, I wanted to like protect them. Like I wanted to create a boundary and make a space. And I think I see my analysis there often as a generosity to my Muslim readers. Like I'm saying to them, it's okay, we can have this conversation without being traitors. Like we're allowed to be in this conversation. And then I'm also helping the readers who are not in that conversation, showing them another way to read that they're not used to reading. So I felt like I was doing that at the same time. So I was basically bringing in the people, like protecting the people in the conversation. And then I was saying, for those of you who are listening in, what if you thought about it like this instead?
I love that response. Not only generosity with respect to telling a story, but also a second generosity in terms of modeling a reading, modeling an analysis. Thank you for that. In later. Oh yeah.
Shall I read?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I've gotten so wrapped up. Your responses have been so full and mesmerizing and that I've forgotten that I was supposed to invite you to read from the book, which I think would be great. I'd love to hear it in your voice. So please do that.
Thank you. And I think actually this is a great place to read it, because now that I've explained what I'm doing, I think the audience will be able to appreciate it. So I'm going to read an excerpt from a chapter called Theft, in which a child is taught a lesson about stealing. And we all do that. Like there's various people, parents do that with their children, teachers do that, legislators, cops, everyone participates in this. So I'm reflecting on the ways that we talk about theft, what can be stolen. Okay, so that's all I'll say.
Fantastic.
Thank you. I have two memories of my grandfather, both from family trips to Pakistan. In one, he's in a bed in one of the rooms in my mamu's portion of the house. The room is painted a light shade of green. It is a house that my grandfather claimed after partition. He fled to Pakistan from India with his family, leaving behind farmlands, cattle, and a haveli, a compound of houses, immovable wealth. Apparently, the way it worked during partition was that if you survived the massacres in your hometown, escaped the knives of your neighbors, jewelers, butchers, and school teachers, once friends, now turned enemies based on lines drawn by white men over lunches in posh rooms. If you survived the violence along the way on the roads and train stations, stations turned for a little while into battlefields and slaughterhouses, running red with rivers of blood. If you finally made it to the place where you were supposed to be, which wasn't your home because that had been left behind, but the place where it had been decided by the people who would never be called thieves, that you'd have to start your life over, then what you would do is find an empty house, another displaced family's home, and move into it and claim it as your own. Finders, keepers, following partition, displacement, massacre. The house my grandparents settled into is a large home that used to belong to a Punjabi Hindu or Sikh family. We know this because it was abandoned. My grandfather claimed it. Growing up, I heard this was a wealthy family's house, evidenced by the fact that they left behind an entire trunk full of chocolates. Now the house is partitioned in two as my grandfather lies weak, ill and dying, surrounded by his children and grandchildren in a room in a part of the house that 2 of his 7 sons live in. The other half is occupied by another son. The sons split the house in two, and the partition was not amicable. The brothers fought over portions of the house, each feeling cheated out of his fair share. And the 3 who claimed the house, 2 in one section and 1 in the other, screwed their remaining siblings, including my mother, out of their rightful claim over a house the family barely had a claim over to begin with. I'm not sure how old I am in this scene. Maybe I'm 5. The white-bearded, light-skinned, frail man on the bed, my grandfather, is dying. Some people are weeping, speaking in hushed tones. There is a sense of great importance in the room. Something is about to happen. I'm not there when it does. I am told that just before he died, he smelled blossoms, asking, where are all the flowers coming from? There were no flowers in the room. This is a good sign. The smell of flowers means he's headed to Jannah, the garden, paradise, encountering its smell before its sight. He smelled heaven while still alive in the liminal space between life and death, where he could still communicate where he could still tell us, there are gardens, there are flowers in paradise. I smell them. The next time I see him, he is dead. His washed body lying on a charpai. There is a huge slab of ice the size of a coffin underneath the charpai, cooling the body from below so it doesn't rot. The body, the charpai, the coffin-sized block of ice are all in the courtyard of the house. I think it's summer, an early evening, so likely about 7 p.m. Some of the adults are wailing. My mother's sister brings me close to the body. Go ahead, look at him. He's your nana, your grandfather, your mother's father. The words for maternal and paternal grandfather are different in Urdu, nana and dada respectively. The difference between these grandfathers is significant. You have different claims over each. They have different kinds of power over you. Go ahead, look at him. He's your nana. Even now, as I remember or manufacture the scene, I am aware that she means to convey something important to me, but I don't get it. Not then, not now. What is she trying to tell me? Maybe she wants me to know where I'm from, my maternal lineage. Maybe she's just overcome with grief and this encounter has nothing to do with me. That's more likely. This is about her. But I don't know that when I'm 5. And more than 30 years later, I remember that exchange, but I doubt she has any recollection. I go into a dark back room off the courtyard, crossing into another section of the house, and hang out with my cousins who are also children. We discuss, try to process what has just happened and how we should behave. Our grandfather just died, says one cousin. We should be sad, says another. Let's cry, suggests a third. Good idea. We agree. So we try to make ourselves cry, mimicking the adults, forcing feelings of sadness I don't actually feel. After all, I never had a relationship with this man who has just died, this man named Asadur Rahman. Beautiful name when you think about it. Not the Lion of God, but the Lion of the Merciful. A name that holds opposites, that imagines fierceness and mercy together at once. As I think back on this strange memory of being in a dark room that feels like a cave, the walls made of stone and brick, moisture seeping through them so the room feels damp, pretending to be sad, fake crying at the death of a grandfather I never knew, I wonder, is this the first memory I have of feeling like a fraud? I wonder too, can grief be stolen? What I'm really asking is, can grief be owned? There's a contested story about the British East India Company involving the thumbs of Bengali weavers. According to oral accounts, the thumbs of Bengali weavers were cut off by the British to prevent them from competing with the East India Company in the textile trade. But a written account by a colonialist himself states that the East India Company's labor practices were so horrific that Bengali weavers cut off their own thumbs rather than allow their labor to be stolen by the British. Where does the truth of the missing thumbs lie? In the oral history of indigenous peoples or the written history of colonizers? Memories too, it turns out, can be stolen. In the episode with the hatchet, I was never physically hurt. The mere threat of God was enough to put the fear of God in me. The mere threat of violence was enough to put the fear of God in me. The fear of God can be more merciful than the fear of the state. God can be shaped and reshaped by us, but we are helpless before the state. And it worked. I learned the lesson I was supposed to, that people and things can be owned, that some people own more things than others, that ownership is virtuous, and even more, it is a protected right. Taking something that someone else claims ownership over is called theft. It does not matter how little you have, or how much they have, or how they came by what they have, because taking it is a crime and a sin. The crime is both moral and legal. Laws, religious and secular, punish the thief. The punishment is often physical, whether it involves cutting off a hand or confining you to a cage, stealing years from your life. I learned this lesson living on stolen land stolen by Europeans from the indigenous peoples whom they mistook as Indians and then called Indians anyways. stealing their identities, their names, their land, their kin, their children, their language, teaching us that what is not owned can still be stolen. So the lesson I learned was this: the powerless have only a merciful God to rely upon, whereas the powerful can rely on the mercy of the state.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ayesha, for most powerful reading. Listening to you, it is, I'm reminded of what a blessing it can be to hear an author read in their own voice. So thank you for that. In the later part of your book, you describe, again in this part, describing your family's push towards adopting Puritanism. You use some quite striking language. You describe your family as, quote, joining a cult the year you were born. What strikes me is not only that description, but a passage that follows shortly after you start using that language of joining a cult. You write "uff," and I believe it's spelled UFF. I think that is how you spell "uff." It's the perfect word, of course. "Uff, I'm struggling to tell this story of my family and the cult. But I resent telling this story because it is too perfect. It gets too much attention. It is titillating and exciting." How, as a writer, do you negotiate the challenge of reflecting honestly upon your life as you have lived it, and the fear of how certain people might receive and position this story? I guess it's just a broader question. How do we as writers center our experiences, our complex humanity, when there are people who will, in fact, use these very expressions of humanity against us?
Yeah, that's such an important question, and I think it's such a perennial question for people who are in marginalized communities when they're writing, because like how to write honestly about the experiences that they have, where, as you say so beautifully, our very humanity can be used against us. I wrote this book entirely by hand, like with a pen and paper in a notebook. So I wrote actually 5 notebooks, and this is 1.5 of them. So I haven't transcribed the rest of them yet. And so it was a very personal space that I was writing in. I was like, I had a pen and a paper. I couldn't like delete, edit, move things around the first time around. And often I would be like sitting on the floor, which is my favorite place to sit when I'm writing, curled up or something. And so it was a really like almost like a cocoon-like space that I would usually write in. I think that in the first round of writing, I really wrote for myself. I wrote the thing I wanted to write. And I tried not to think about like any kind of external gaze. Of course, I was thinking about external gazes all the time, but I was really trying my best not to center like a mean, critical, hostile audience at all. I was trying to keep them at bay. I was like, there will be time. I'll let your eyes in a second, just not right now. And then during the editing process, I was imagining, as I said earlier, an audience that was kind and compassionate and wanted to hear what I had to say so that I could allow myself to carry on being as soft as possible, because I didn't want to be hard in the writing. I wanted to be loving, but at the same time, of course, I was thinking all the time about how to write as responsibly as I could, so that people wouldn't misunderstand what I was saying, knowing full well that I don't actually control what people do with the writing in the end. That's their responsibility, but I can do my best to try to make sure I'm as clear as possible about what it is that I'm trying to say. So that's one of the things. And the other thing that I learned, but I want to say in this process is, we are so often formed by the things that we resist. So the thing that was far more curious to me in the writing was, when were the times when I was replicating or reproducing a white supremacist, heteropatriarchal, capitalist discourse unthinkingly in my writing? And how was I going to be accountable about doing that? So when would I notice it? And when did I like noticing it, bring it into the writing? Like, you know, I think in the chapter on scripts, I actually talk about how I had such an Orientalist understanding of the Middle East when I went to the Middle East. And I wanted to really reflect on that, about, you know, being raised in the society where I felt like alienated from it, and yet had absorbed and internalized all of its ideas about ourselves, about the Middle Eastern people, you know, and about this region called the Middle East, which is a term that the CIA came up with. So, you know, I just, you know, so I had to like think about really carefully. And that for me, like that was a far more interesting and fascinating journey. And I think paying attention to that also created a capaciousness to think, like it just made space to actually be in a conversation that was more honest and more interesting than just sort of reducing the conversation to someone who is going to be racist or bigoted or hostile. Thank
you. Once again, the following question probably is might offer a means to continue, I guess, elaborating upon those very points. And that begins with the way I would like to ask it, in fact, is by reading some extraordinary lines, in fact, from your book. I have, I should say, in preparing for this interview, I made a very large document of extraordinary lines that started to get far too, you know, just unmanageable. But here's one of them that really struck me. You write, "When people ask me why I wore niqab or why I took it off, I rarely tell the truth." And you go on to say, "These conversations, when they are conversations, can feel like a kind of non-consensual dance where I learn what people want to hear and then try my best not to disappoint them and ruin the evening." And what follows here is I truly believe such a brilliant metaphor. You write, "I am a reluctant participant because this dance demands I tailor the truth of my experience to a garment that is too constricting. In doing this, I am forced to confront the truth of my experience, a truth that is painful, too difficult even to admit to myself, never mind share with strangers." There's so much in everything I read there, but it's perhaps that last sentence that I wondered if you could elaborate upon. "In doing so, I am forced to confront the truth of my experience, the truth that is painful, too difficult even to admit to myself, never mind share with strangers." Yeah, you know, that line comes closer to the end of the book. Later on in the book. And I think up until that point, I've been wrestling so much with these standard scripts that we have, that we're told, that we inherit, that we're told about ourselves, that don't capture our full humanity, that sort of take our experiences and they funnel them into these standard simplistic scripts, which are necessarily reductive and they strip away our complexity. And so in that way, they're very dehumanizing and alienating. Like, can you measure the progress, quote unquote progress of a society by how much women or how little women cover? So can women bodies be the measurement for your piety or your virtue or your freedom? And so, but what I was reflecting on by the time I get to that place is like, what does it cost us to be raised with these scripts? And one of the things that it costs us, I think, is it cuts us off from ourselves even. So, you know, if we buy into these scripts and then we have an experience that breaks from the script, which will necessarily happen because we're human beings, then that leads us to a kind of crisis. And so, and what it does is it makes it so difficult to admit either like what is actually happening to you when it's happening to you. And it also makes it very difficult to make sense of what has happened after the fact. And so, you know, the scripts fail us. And then furthermore, when the scripts become the narratives, the scripts, these ideas become politicized, like the veil, but it's not the veil that's politicized, it's women's bodies that are politicized. When we become politicized, then there's just like no room for our humanity left because we just become ideas and symbols to other people. And at the same time, I was also negotiating with the fact that when you break a script, having become aware of it,
it's like really stressful to do, you know, thinking of that dance metaphor that I used there. It's like literally being on a dance floor and trying to dance to different music. It's like, imagine that scene. It's a very uncomfortable thing to do. If you do that, or if you maybe walk off to the side of the dance floor, it's very difficult to separate what you're doing from how what you're doing is perceived by other people. And so you're in this weird like psychological space. And so in the book, I was trying really hard to start with the human first instead of the idea. And that's why I think the embodied theory was so important to me, because I think the human, like focusing on the human and moving out from there. So the veil is like one of the things that we're talking about. It makes, the human makes obvious the kinds of monstrosities and the tyrannies that a state or a religion or a family must engage in if they're going to force people to do one thing or another thing. And so that's what I was trying to highlight in that, I think in that chapter.
Thank you again. I guess the next question might take up once again the issue of scripts that we are sometimes tempted to adopt and then we sometimes reject. And I think it relates perhaps so well to the last parts of your reading, on which there was a necessary critique or awareness of, I would say, the script of Canadianness. So the way I'd ask this question is by drawing attention to a kind of a passage that I again enjoyed in your book. At one point in high school, you describe yourself as growing, quote, testy, frustrated, and annoyed at being asked questions about wearing hijab. And there's so many funny responses because what you do, I think so, is quite a brilliant, stylistic choice. You take out the voices of those asking the questions, and you simply offer a list of your own responses. So it's, and here are just some of the responses. I wear this because of my religion. I am Muslim. I believe it's one of the first responses, but other ones, nothing would happen if you saw my hair, or no, I don't wear it to sleep. One response you offer is, I'm from here. I was born in Canada. And there's an exclamation point after I'm from here. One can imagine the frustration that you would begin experiencing. And then you write, and so this isn't a voiced response. This is what you're offering us as your own internal thoughts. You write, and then in my head, you say this is what a Canadian looks like, motherfuckers. You describe at first a sense of defiance in claiming this Canadianness, but then you very carefully and elaborately point out the problems of claiming Canadianness. It reminds me of lessons and that I have derived from an author, Dion Brand, a Black writer, I feel a very, very strong connection with. And she writes in A Map to the Door of No Return, one of her nonfiction books, a memoir of sorts, that it is tempting to want to try to enter this nation that so excludes us, so fundamentally excludes us as a condition of its own existence. She's speaking of Black people in this case. And then she adds, it's tempting to want to enter nation. And she says, but nation predicated on what? And you arrive at a very similar critique. And again, through a similarly, well, maybe I'll just stop there. But yeah, I wonder if you could talk a little bit, offer us a little bit about that critique. Why is that claiming of Canadianness so important for you to critique?
Right, great question. I had not read that book by Dion Brand, but that sounds interesting and I want to check it out. I feel like it sounds beautiful, actually. I can't wait to check it out. I think like there's a genre of literature called when someone writes something, I don't know if it's a genre, I'm not a real writer. I don't know what that means, but
Not
so,
true. I'm afraid that's not true.
I don't know all the canonical texts that I'm supposed to know. But I think like there's this idea that I have encountered, which is that when someone writes a book where they're searching for home, that there's like a lot of like, I imagine like a rosy like hue to that, and it's like a beautiful, it's like always like meant to be like, you know, you struggle to get to this place called home, and this is supposed to be always like a noble journey. And this passage that you're talking about comes quite early in the book. It's like in the third chapter of the book, and so at that point, I'm already thinking about, you know, in the search for home, the question that I'm curious about is, in our search for belonging, like what are the violences that we make that are made necessary in our need to belong, in our claims for belonging? That's like the question that I'm thinking about in that book. And it's not an easy place to get to, I want to say. Like for the longest time, that chapter ended with, "This is what a Canadian looks like, motherfuckers," like, and that's it. And then luckily I was writing with a community of writers and who were generous and kind and leaned on me to develop that further and go beyond, to go beyond that response that feels very satisfying, but ultimately is not a fulfilling resting place, actually. And so the chapter, so that last section there, that move, is like, you know, essential to the chapter. And I'm so grateful for the feedback that I received that helped me move beyond it. But it's wrestling with this, exactly this paradox that as you say, is that when a person is a victim of systemic inequality, often we can be made to feel like the thing that will save us is belonging to that system of inequality, just having a different position in that space. Like, so just not being at this station, but being a little bit higher up. And, but in doing that, we become complicit in other people's oppression. And so I'm reflecting on the fact that sometimes when we're on the receiving end of systemic inequality, whether it's race, class, gender, nation state, religious community, when we claim this victimhood, the claim to victimhood, which I am doing in that chapter earlier on, can become a claim to purity and absolution. And when that happens, then it obfuscates our own complicity in forms of domination and oppression that actually we are complicit in through other kind, like, so if like, you know, through race, class, gender, nation state, religious community, etc. So I wanted to really meditate in that section. I wanted to meditate on that. And what's beautiful to me about that section is I was able to, the key for meditating on that, again, came from the Quranic text, a verse that I really love that talks about there's no refuge from God except from God. And this idea of like, what does it mean when the nation state does that, when the nation state claims itself as a refuge from itself, or when a family does that, or when a religion does that, when any of us do that, what is the violence that makes necessary?
Such a thank you once again for a response that that I find so necessary, so urgent at this particular moment, as always. That question of those strategies of belonging and that reflect necessarily complicity in other people's suffering, and how, you know, I think the I guess another writer, Leanne Simpson, Indigenous writer, uses this term constellations of care. Constellations of co-resistance, very similar to that beautiful phrase from Manel, constellations of care. And I think that can only arise through that resistance that you described, the resistance to the script that at times seems understandable, it seems strategic, it seems at certain moments the thing that needs to be said and insisted upon, and yet is provides, I guess, dangers. But you put it so powerfully. Thank you again. Just looking at the time here, I think we're good. So there is a line, again, one of the many lines that I've found myself copying out and reflecting upon, And it is a line, in fact, that you use more than once in your book. And I think it's an extraordinarily useful one, and it's also, written so compellingly. The line is this: beware of the one who seeks to save you on the assumption of his own exceptionalism. What do you mean by this line? It is in two contexts, at least, that are in the book, but it's the line itself that I find so powerful. Beware of the one who seeks to save you on the assumption of his own exceptionalism.
Right. I think the line comes in, if I'm not wrong, 3 times in one chapter.
Yeah, I was wondering. I thought it was. I knew it was at least 2, and then I thought there was a third one, but I couldn't find it. Thank you.
I think it's 3 times. I think it is. And
Sure.
and each time it changes. It's like his exceptionalism, her exceptionalism, or their exceptionalism.
That's right.
Just to like sort of draw attention to that. So as you say that, it strikes me how much of this book is about Puritanism, about like a study of Puritanism and trying to find it, to root it out, to hold it to the light, to examine it, like all the ways that it permeates our lives. And I'm thinking, I was thinking when I wrote that line about a number of things. One is, I think we're so often told that if we are raised being told that we need to be saved, then we come to believe that about ourselves, and we look for saviors, and then we put them on a pedestal, and then we're so disappointed when they're unable to save us. And I think, and we can be hurt in the process. And I think the book, that chapter in particular, is like following my journey of doing that to various people. Like I'm looking for someone to be the person who's going to save me. And each time, I learn, the more I learn about them, the less I realize, the less they can save me. The other part of that is that I wanted to think also about all the ways that we do that all the time, as again, as parents, as siblings, as children to our parents, sometimes as teachers, as scholars, as lawmakers. We will put ourselves in a position without even thinking about it, unthinkingly almost, where we are like certain that we know the right thing for someone else, that we think that somehow we have special knowledge that they don't have. And instead of being in a conversation, the conversation can be very one directional. So I wanted to think about that. And, there's a quote from Toni Morrison that for me is so central in understanding that. She says, if you need someone to be on their knees so you can feel tall, then you have a problem. And I feel like that line is a meditation on that, on that quote, basically, is like, what are the ways that we exceptionalize ourselves to a place of purity, so then we can know we can know with certainty the answer to something.
You mentioned this in this very response. You mentioned your book as in part, but very powerfully, it's a major part of the book, critique of Puritanism. There's a passage on Puritanism that, again, I just love to read and see if it could prompt from you a response. All expressions of Puritanism are inhuman because Puritanism hates what the human is because Puritanism hates what is human about us. It demands that we transcend our own humanity. You also write, Puritanism rears its ugly head most prominently and most devastatingly at the major markers of human life: birth, marriage, death. And Puritanism likewise misses the point about the ephemerality of life, demanding abstinence rather than indulgence. I wonder if you could speak a bit about your book is about particular lived experiences, but I can't help but think that the critique that you mount of Puritanism is of global reach, and again of so urgent for this particular moment. I wonder if you could speak a bit more about why Puritanism emerged as a subject so important to confront in your book.
So I feel like thank you for that question. And I think you're right. The book is about something about it's about Puritanism, and it's not just like limited to the stories that I'm telling. I'm thinking of the stories as like a lens through which to think about other expressions of Puritanism. So in the chapter that you read the lines from, Please Water Me, that chapter is thinking forthright, straightforwardly about Puritanism. And I'm thinking about Puritanism as a religion because I'm thinking of it as a worship of the pure, any kind of worship of the pure. It can be a formal religion that does that. It can be a mindset that does that. It can be, I see it in our desire in our society in various ways to want to be clean, to be straight, to have like an essay structure, even that is like a clear thesis statement followed by, straight 3 arguments and 3 counter arguments. And that we're really bothered by things when they're messy, when they're complicated, when they're unruly. And the thing that worries me or that bothers me, that my critique of Puritanism is that it's the worship of an idea over and against the human. And that's a problem that I have. And so our humanity in the face of this idea becomes sullied. It's sullying as well. And it disfigures our humanity, I think, when we worship an idea of the pure. And it especially disfigures the idea of us as human animals, which we are. So in this chapter, I explored this universal phenomena through the lens of Islam, and I couldn't think of anything that resists a vision of purity more strikingly than grief, because grief it cannot be disciplined. It is unruly. It does not follow a schedule. It does not have stages. It does what it's going to do. It's leaky. It's messy, and it never goes away. And one of the things that I really powerfully experienced is that when grief and Puritanism confront each other, when Puritanism is confronted with grief, you basically have a choice. You can either disfigure yourself and submit to the Puritanism, or you can submit to the human and see that our ideas of the pure might be misguided, and maybe even rooted in self-hate, and that actually love means accepting all of us as we are. And I think in so many ways, the book is actually a resistance to the idea of Puritanism, both in its form, I think that it's not incidental that the work of so many people of color is always considered genre bending because it doesn't fit into a box. It's in its form and in its content, where I'm refusing to separate ideas of a person away from the lived experience of that person, even if that means that I have to be more vulnerable.
Yeah. There's I'm thinking now of the way in which this discussion of Puritanism, and again, it is so powerfully elaborated, and in your book can lead into a question about writing itself. Because I think if I'm following the points that you're laying out, not only in this conversation, but you're evoking so powerfully again in the book, there's puritanical thought. I think there is something like a puritanical style. That would be forms, discourses that we use that are quite set and rigid, and there are prescriptions and conventions that limit how we express things, and then necessarily what we express, how we think. And I would have to say that sometimes academic discourse can feel very puritanical in that sense. Disciplines in their particular discourses can be, not necessarily, because I truly do, and I'm not just saying this, I do value the work that is performed, can be performed in the academy, notwithstanding its the violent origins of these institutions that we work within. I guess my point is that what you present for us is a book that is, I hope I'm putting this in the right way, that is at once analytically sharp and fierce, and yet gloriously untidy, in the sense that it roams so freely. It is not afraid to address subjects or speak about things that are dangerous or taboo. Likewise, when you when you think about something, you don't go actually straight to the quote unquote right answer. You second guess yourself, and then you second guess yourself again. And in that is a marvelous kind of, so marvelously instructive, I feel. So I guess my question is really, maybe not so much about puritanical writing, but were there, could you describe for us the writing process for this book? Were there sections that you took out? Did you question whether what is left in would be left in? Did you wonder if, were you looking, notwithstanding the death that precipitates this book and so powerfully, were you wondering about the overall structure of the book? Okay, how does this fit together? These are questions, selfish questions I think about.
Okay. Thank you for that question. I really appreciate it. I think, the writing of the book, as I mentioned, I didn't mean to write it. I just found myself writing it, and it was with a pen and paper, which was, I hadn't done that since high school. So it was a really neat experience to do that. I don't normally write with a pen and paper. I mean, I do now, actually. Once I started, I couldn't stop. And I even wrote like an academic essay like that. Like I've even been writing those in that way, because it's just, I've discovered that I think better. I am able to speak in more voices when I do that much more fluidly. And so I was writing it like that. And I think like one of the most crucial things for me about the writing process with this book was I would share the writing as soon as I wrote it. As soon as I wrote it. So I would like read it out loud to my partner, and I would read it out loud to my friends, and I would immediately be receiving feedback about, questions that it raised for them, places they wanted it to go. And so I was like, I really feel like I never felt like I was writing alone. I was always like, I was constantly in conversation, deep conversation with a community of people who were always giving me feedback. And even when the book was done, I did a workshop for it, like 10 people came to that, and from different like backgrounds, different age groups, they gave me feedback on that. And then I also had, and from academics, non-academics, and then I also had a group of friends who were like reading the book, and colleagues who were generous with their time, who were reading the book, reading sections of the book. And so I was really fortunate in that way to be able to share with so many people. And that for me is like, so I feel like it was a dialectical process. Much of the book is actually the way it came out, in the order that it came out of me, to be honest. The last chapters, Children and Please Water Me, Children came later, maybe months later, and Please Water Me came maybe a year and a half later. I wasn't ready to write that. So from the beginning of writing the book. And in the, so that's like one part of that. And then with writing, I feel like there was something else. Yes, so in terms of taking things out, I was, oh my gosh, I was racked the whole time about, I just didn't want to do harm with the book. I wanted the work to be loving. I wanted it to be received in a loving way. I wanted people to be able to see its generosity. I wanted it to feel like a healing book, not for everybody, but at least for some people. And I was really scared that I would be too hard, and I wouldn't be able to, that I would not be able to create a space that someone could grow in. And to grow, you need to be able to be soft and bendy. And if you're hard and brittle, you break. So I really wanted to create this space. And up until the very end, actually maybe like right at the end of the process, I took out 4 chapters of the book. And my publishing editor was like completely shocked that I did that, because she felt like I was tricking her or something, because she said that mostly she's used to having authors feel so preciously about their words that they're not willing to get rid of even a single word. And then I was taking out 4 chapters. And I took those chapters out because I realized I just didn't think that they were making either the argument that I wanted them to make the way I wanted them to make it. So I needed to think about them more. And one of them in particular was a chapter about experiencing really intense racism in a small little village in central New York. And I wrote and rewrote that chapter, and I wrote like 30 more pages to try to figure out what it was about. And I couldn't figure it out. And it was only months later that I was like, oh, that's a chapter, that story is about me trying to belong to whiteness through class. But I didn't realize that, so the racism was there, but my response to it was try to belong to whiteness through a performance of class. And I just couldn't figure it out in time. And so maybe it'll see maybe it'll see the light of day at a different point. But it's an example of where my editor was like, that's such a good story. And I'm like, I know it's a good story. I just don't want to tell it right now. It's not, I can't tell it right.
Those are great decisions to be able to make as authors, definitely. So there will be a question period. I'm just, if people want to post their questions, they can do so now. I have one more question, just maybe a shorter one before we can get to it. For me, your book is again extraordinarily powerful for its portrayal of grief, of the death of someone truly beloved, and for its awareness of vulnerability, to deep ethics of an awareness to vulnerability that extends not simply to the individual who has passed in the book, your nephew, but to others. That's where I see that awareness of vulnerability going. It is also, as you've expressed so compellingly, a critique of Puritanism, which, among other things, is a denial of our vulnerability. That's its part of its violence, a denial of our vulnerability and the vulnerability of others. Your book is also, I would say, about inheritance and about the ambivalence we have regarding inheritance, how we can't possibly really escape our inheritances, and yet how we can't also not think and question and do other things with our inheritances.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It so does. It so does. I recently just finished reading a book by Patrick Rizal, the poet. It's called A Tongue, A-T-A-N-G, and it's online. He self-published it. Actually, it's a really neat book. And the way that he speaks about his ancestors in the book is a way that resonates with me, which is that, I don't know if I want to meet my ancestors, and I don't know if I'll like them. I don't know if they're like me. And I feel like, so I think you're right to pick up on that ambivalence, but I also feel like in terms of inheritance, it also feels to me like a relationship. So, and one of the things that I think, one of the ideas that I think influences my relationship with inheritance and ancestors, which is to me is connected, is actually the Quran. So in the Quranic text, when a prophet comes to a people, when he calls them towards justice, the prophet is usually a he, and he calls them to justice, and he asks them to stop cheating the poor and be more equitable. The prophets often say, because there's going to be a life after death, and when you die, you're going to be accountable before God for what you did. And the response when the Prophet Muhammad was saying this to the Meccans was, the Meccans were like, wait a second, are you saying we're going to be brought back to life after we're dead? So instead of the justice conversation, they were focusing on the logistics of, is this really true? How is that going to happen? And again, I'm just reminded of Toni Morrison. This is the third time I brought her up, but she has this beautiful quote. I don't know where I read somewhere, where she says, we take refuge in the why, from the why in the how. So I think of that verse in relation to that. They're immediately asking the question of how are we going to be raised? And then they ultimately reject the claim by saying, some of them do, by saying, well, our ancestors didn't believe that, so we don't believe it. And the Quran says, well, what if your ancestors were stupid? And the Quran actually says that. But I love that line, because the what if is the most important part of that line for me, because our ancestors were people, and some of them did wonderful things and some of them did terrible things, and some of the same people did both of those things. And so no one can be reduced to an essence. There's no one is one thing or another. And I feel that verse calls me to be in relationship with my tradition and with my ancestors, and to recognize that sometimes I'm going to want to adopt something that they said because I think it's good, but other times I'm going to question the morality of what I'm receiving, and that my position on that will change. So we're making choices in relationship to our tradition and our inheritance, but the choices, even when they're ours, are not always ours.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question, in fact, from someone listening that may, in fact, bridge with your last points. So the question begins, in the polarizing climate that we constantly observe in the news and social media, your words, Ayesha, really opened new aspects of how to view certain things instead of choosing from the many false dichotomies that are put on display. For example, politicizing women's bodies, what is Canadian, etc. I guess the question then is, what would you say to new settlers today when they find themselves struggling between assimilation and conforming to non-Western traditions versus trying to find and staying true to themselves?
That's such a good question. That's such a good that's such a good question, and it's a question that I think to answer, I have to immediately think about my own positionality when I'm answering it, right? I'm a newcomer to this land. I was not invited to be here, but I come from a tradition. You know, my grandparents were displaced from their home by colonialism. So I think of myself as the result of a double diaspora. So they were displaced from India to Pakistan, my parents, and then, you know, when you move a tree, it's not going to always take root in the new place that you put it. And they had a hard time economically because they had left all their wealth behind, their immovable wealth behind. And so they came to Canada because, and I talk about this in the book, my father, like, Canada was inviting applications from, they were looking for people who did the work that he did, which was a welder and a pipe fitter. And so, and when he went in for the immigration interview, the guy asked him, he said, the interview officer said, "Where do you want to go?" And my dad said, "Where are the jobs?" And he said, "Toronto." And that's how I came to be born in Toronto. And so, and I guess, like, you know, one of the questions that I'm raising in the book is about this question about assimilation, and what does it mean to assimilate, and how do we live on this land responsibly? Like, is there a way to live responsibly on this land that is also, you know, the result of, like, we are here only because of colonialism. Like, it's because of the Queen that my family moved from India to Pakistan, and then Pakistan to a Commonwealth country, Canada. So there's so much genocide and violence in that history. And so one of the things that I did want to trouble, especially for, you know, children of immigrants like us, or immigrants who are trying so hard to be Canadian, is to, like, just say, like, I just wanted to make space to, like, stop for a second and be like, what are we assimilating into? What kind of a person do we want to be on this land? And what does it mean to claim citizenship? Inherit the sins of the state, which we do when we become citizens and when we live here. How do we atone for that? And I think, again, like, over there, religion, like in a place like this, religious language is so useful because, you know, atonement is not a thing you can ever complete. It's like a process that you're always engaged in. It's always a relationship that you're participating in. The word for atonement in Islam in the Quran is tawbah, which means to return, a return. So you're always trying to return, knowing that you're never going to reach the end, the place you're trying to get to.
Thank you. That's a wonderful response to, as you say, a wonderful question. I don't see a question right now. I'm not sure if I'm managing it well myself. This could be my thing. I do want to, you know, if another question is being loaded or coming, I wanted to ask you. It's kind of a almost a selfish question. I'd love to read more of your writing in this form, in this voice. Do you have another writing project like this in mind? Are there things that you just mentioned there were things that you felt that you weren't able to release and publish and share at this point? Are there what is there a new project in this vein ahead of you?
I think there is. I think at first, you know, when I wrote those 5 notebooks, and I think I mentioned this is like 1.5 of them. I do have a ton more writing that I've done in the same vein. And I initially thought of it actually as maybe a trilogy, but I think it was but then it wasn't a trilogy. As I was writing, it became a book in and of itself. And so, so I think I do have 2 more books in it, and I'm going to be, transcribing them. But I also am just really just, in this place, I feel, of like taking things in, of like learning and listening and reflecting. And I think I really like believe now that I actually don't know what the next book will look like. I mean, I think I was so certain about what it was going to look like until I got to here. And now I'm just like, I don't know, actually, because I'm reading all this really cool, these neat works that are really weird, but are, to me, like speaks to me in a way that other stuff has never spoken to me. Like John Edgar Weideman's work, for example, is speaking to me so deeply right now. And he's such a strange writer, and I love it so much. So I hope that whatever I write next is weirder.
I know, Ayesha, you'll have a profoundly, eager audience for your next book. I have enjoyed your book tremendously. And I wonder if this, unless there's another question, I wonder if I see claps and chairs being offered in the Q&A, but that's not a question at this moment.
David, there is a question, if you don't mind me
Oh
piping
yeah,
up
please.
from
Yeah,
our provost.
Sorry, I couldn't see it. Yeah.
It's okay. Can you see it there? Or?
No, I can't. But please offer it. Yeah.
It's so. Aisha, this question's from our provost, Andrew Zeri, and he's asking, what is the profile of the person you would most like to read this book, and why?
Oh my gosh. That's such a great question. And the answer that's popped into my head is so weird that I'm just gonna say it. I think I would love to know what Dave Chappelle thinks about it. Because, he converted to Islam, and he's a complicated, contentious thinker. But I do think of him as a thinker, and I wonder, if I'm really curious, like I really don't know what he would think about it, but if I'm really curious about someone's opinions right now in this moment when you ask this question, which I never considered really before, that's the person that comes into my head. It's a weird answer.
I mean, one thing that we spoke a little bit about this before actually starting the interview live, and the irony of you and I, who began being formally trained as academics, producing scholarly writing, is that suddenly we produce this type of writing, and even if people may have in our fields may have appreciated what we've written, suddenly there's a broader audience, and an audience that really is bigger than we we may have imagined. So I would love to know what David what Chappelle also,
because he converted to Islam. He has this whole relationship with
Islam. Yeah. No,
yeah.
That is so funny. Well, now I think we are at time. I want to begin by doing just a round of thanks. First to the interpreters, Corina and Kirsten. Thank you so much for the work that you've done. I always find it amazing work. I want to thank the audience for tuning in. I know I suspect you've had as amazing experiences I have listening to Ayesha speak about her work, and I'm going to go away from this continuing to think about the work. I want to thank Gage for the kind introduction and the thoughtful words. I want to thank Manel, of course, for setting up this series, and congratulate her on her move into her new position, and thank her for the visionary work that you do, Manel. Asmin also, who is an administrator who set up this this event. Thank you for your work. Finally, Ayesha, thank you for being in conversation with me. Thank you for writing this book, and thank you for immensely thoughtful responses to my questions and to the questions of others.
Thank you for honoring me by being in this conversation as well. I'm really grateful to you, and grateful to everyone who helped organize this.
the honor is mine. Thank you. Take care.